All right, Donald. Well, first of all, thanks again for doing this and taking the time. I know you spend a lot of your time writing, and it's a privilege to be able to talk to you. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me.
You got it. So I know we're going to talk a lot today about COVID specifically, but I'd like to give ample background to the situation that you found yourself in probably January of 2020 and the prep work that you had done leading up to that, just professionally. Maybe as an initial question, I would love to learn how you got into science journalism in the first place. What was kind of the rationale from your side to begin down that road professionally at the beginning?
Okay. It's not a decision I made. It just happened to me. I'd been a journalist really my entire life since I started writing for my high school magazine, and was editor of executive editor of the Daily Californian at Berkeley. And then I came to New York looking for a newspaper job. Got lost on my way out to Long Island trying to get an interview with Newsday and arrived 3 hours late. Had an interview with Time Magazine, didn't get hired there. And some cousins of mine whom I was staying with had a next door neighbor who was an editor at the New York Times, and he agreed to see me and read my college clips and said, well, these are good for a college student, but you're not ready to be a reporter here. But if you want to be a copy boy, I'll put your name in for that job. And copy boy is literally carrying copy from the reporters up to the desk, because everybody typed on books of carbon paper in those days, and going downstairs to get the papers off the press so they can fix the errors in them for the second edition, and making the 11 o'clock coffee run in Times Square and all sorts of things. And I worked my way up from there. The way I ended up in science was I was actually the Broadway theater columnist in Culture for a while, for 1 year. I was terrible at it. I have still never seen Oklahoma performed live on stage. I was picked for the job because I had been an editor. I hated it. I was making people unhappy with the way I edited them. And I asked my boss if I could go back to writing. And the next opening he had was for the theater column. This is not the theater critic. This is the guy who wrote the sort of news of the Rialto. It was a column called On Stage and Off, and it was theater business and gossip and stuff like that. So it was a reporter's job. And I had some years back written a play that was produced way off Broadway, totally panned by the Times. But that was more experience than anybody else he had on the staff that had at the time. So I was the theater correspondent. And my then wife was angling to be a foreign correspondent, which she had been doing for a while because she wanted to climb the ladder at the Times, and that's how you did it. In those days, you never made it onto the masthead unless you had been a foreign correspondent. And so suddenly one day she got taken out to lunch by the editor-in-chief, who said, okay, South Africa, Moscow, Jerusalem, Bangkok, and Rio, they're all coming up in the next 6 months. You and Donald talk about it tonight. Let me know tomorrow where you'd like to go. And we couldn't quite make up our mind that night. So he said, all right, I'll decide. Johannesburg. So we had to go home and tell the kids, hey, kids, guess what? As soon as kindergarten ends, we're moving to Africa. And, they burst into tears and stuff. But so we ended up moving to Johannesburg, and I was a correspondent there. Well, she was the bureau chief. I was the bureau non-chief member. And so she was doing most of the truth and the apartheid-related stuff, end of apartheid. Mandela was president, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was going on. And I was sort of looking for other stories. And I was traveling to the other countries in Southern Africa, and I started writing about AIDS, because AIDS was everywhere outside of South Africa, but it was actually not a big thing in South Africa. In fact, bizarrely, there was a rumor that it was a disease that didn't affect Africans. It only affected white gay men, because in South Africa, the closing of the borders because of apartheid, the boycott by all the rest of Africa, had not only kept trucks out of there and kept the South African rugby team from playing anybody else, but it had closed the borders, including to AIDS. And so the disease was just beginning to creep over the borders. And there was a great deal of denialism about it. The country didn't realize how rapidly the infection was growing. So I started covering it both in South Africa and outside of South Africa. Then we were moved to Paris after 4 years there. And I wasn't covering France because my French isn't really good enough to report in. I missed the jokes and interviews and things. So I was covering Eastern Europe and going back to Africa to write more about AIDS, and particularly about the lack of access to drugs there. The drugs then cost $15,000 a year for a regimen. And I went to India and wrote the first story about Indian companies that were capable of making perfectly good AIDS drugs, and for little money. And soon after that, the head of one of the companies called me and said, I'm willing to make these drugs for $365 a year, $1 a day, if I can find a market. So that became a front page story, and that sort of started the ball rolling to what eventually became the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and the whole phenomenon that we see now of companies in India making drugs, including vaccines, COVID vaccines, for Africa and for the rest of the poor world. So I came back. All that time, I was officially a foreign correspondent. So I was also covering the aftermath of 9/11. I went to Somalia for that and stuff, and other countries. And then we came back from overseas kind of abruptly, and the editors didn't know what to do with me, and I hadn't really planned what was going to happen to me. So I went to see the editor-in-chief, Hal Raines, and said, okay, I'm back. And he said, you want to go back to culture and cover theater? I said, no, I'm a different person now, and I wasn't that good at that anyway. He said, well, how about science? We got science reporters. So I said, sure. So I went up to talk to the science editor and said, first she said, well, I don't have a spot for you on my payroll. And I said, well, the boss says I work for you. Maybe you could check and see. And she said, all right, well, I need a health writer. And I said, okay, I've done some of that, but you've got 2 MDs on your staff writing about cancer and heart disease and the things that Americans die of. How about letting me write about third world diseases? And she, malaria, AIDS, worms, diseases, tuberculosis, all the things other people die of, poor people die of. And she originally said, well, we don't really have a mandate to do that. And I said, oh, come on. I mean, we write about wars in those countries. We write about it when people die in bus plunges in those countries. 2 billion people are at risk of dying of these diseases. How about we cover it? And she said, all right, we'll make it an experiment. And that's essentially what it was. It was an experiment. And it became a beat. I mean, I was the first person to have that beat, global health, at the Times. And now my replacement is a woman named Stephanie Nolan, whom I think is great. So that's how I got into it. And it sort of expanded into covering all infectious diseases. I'm really lousy on heart disease and cancer and surgery and a few other things, except as they relate to, what used to be called the third world is now, underdeveloped countries and developing countries.
Your own, I'd be curious to know what along the way you did, or how you learned scientifically enough to produce this output. Did you have to go back to school? Was it kind of on the job training? How did you learn the scientific details of, for example, viruses specifically, which I know we're going to be talking a lot about today?
Sure. I was pre-med for 1 year in college. I didn't get very far in it. Organic chemistry, I took a look at it when I can't do this. Did not go to medical school. I did enjoy the courses in human biology, so I learned some stuff there. And then for the rest of it, I'm a big reader, and I pay attention when I interview people. And, I would talk to scientists, and they were extremely patient. And I'm not afraid to appear stupid, especially when I am stupid about a topic, and to say, look, can you explain an antibody to me? Is it a protein? Where does it come from? How is it made? Can you explain how does the antibody attach to the virus? And people from Tony Fauci on down, were happy to talk about their work and very patient with explaining it to me. So I eventually, figured it out. I'm no virologist. I'm no microbiologist. I do not have a degree in any of this stuff, but I kind of understand the basics, I think, pretty well now. And it was all learning on the job.
And for an audience would be listening to this show who almost certainly is not any of those things, how would you describe that? How would you describe a virus in its most basic form?
A virus is nothing but a little empty protein shell with a lot of spikes on the outside of it that allow it to attach to cells. And all it does is break open the wall of the cell and inject its genetic material, DNA or RNA, which hijacks that cell's machinery, that is the human cell, and forces it to produce more viruses. It just makes copies of itself. I've had it described to me as like a commando team that lands in a village and takes over the auto parts factory in the village and converts it to making bombs. And this professor was actually trying to explain to me antigen presenting cells, which is a sort of signaling thing in the immune system. And he said, what I specialize in is it's as if somebody a worker in the auto factory who's been forced to make bombs now runs to the window and waves a bomb part out of the window to alert the rest of the town that the factory has been hijacked. And that ramps up the defenses so the town gets together and attacks the factory. And that's antigen presentation in virology.
Yeah. Last night, as I was preparing for this interview, I went back through your Times reporting, and I think the first notation related to the coronavirus, to COVID-19, that you wrote about was late January of 2020. And I believe the headline of that article was related to pneumonia-like symptoms that were being discovered in a new virus in China. I would love for you to speak to that, and also, if you can, to paint the picture of what you, having had all this background in infectious diseases and viruses as a journalist, what you were seeing, what you remember noticing at that time that may have begun to set off some alarm bells for you.
Okay. There was such an article, but that wasn't where it started. Basically, I subscribe to a disease alert service called ProMed, which I get on my phone and in my email, and I try to read it, and it tells you about outbreaks of diseases all over, and they can be anything from encephalitis in horses to Ebola in humans in Africa to banana wilt disease. If you read it, it terrifies you because it's like one epidemic after another starting in every kind of species in the world, plants and animals and humans. And I noticed on the night of December 30th, a note about a mysterious outbreak of pneumonia in Wuhan, in China. I didn't know where Wuhan was, not one of the cities I'd heard of, but it made me think, wow, this is a little bit like the beginning of SARS, because I did cover the beginning of SARS, and there were, in that case, the reports of mysterious pneumonias inside cities in southern China, which is back in 2003, I think it was, went on for weeks. And ProMed was, putting out these requests for information saying, does anybody know? Does anybody know? And at the time, China was engaged in an enormous cover-up, like a full body press cover-up directed by Beijing. And so we didn't find out for weeks what was going on. So anyway, I thought, the other thing I've learned about ProMed is that they are constantly declaring dangerous situations that could turn into a pandemic that turn out to be nothing. Like I remember there was a wedding in a rural village somewhere in West Africa, and 20 guests from the wedding died, and within days after the wedding, and it looked like, oh my God. And I kept watching it. Turned out it was a really bad batch of homemade alcohol that had been served at the wedding and poisoned a whole lot of people. It just took them a little while to die from liver and kidney failure. So I put it in my head scratcher pile as something to watch. And actually, a couple of days later, I went off on a fishing vacation to Argentina. First time I'd ever gone trout fishing, outside the country, and I'd planned it for a long time, and so I went. And the friend of mine who was along on the trip said, "Donald, you got weirder and weirder as that trip went on, because we would spend the days fishing, and you'd come back and you'd, read the news and listen. You'd come to dinner, kind of going, I'm not sure. Things are looking worse in China than I thought. This might be a problem." And but I didn't. It was after I came back. Which was so I helped my colleagues in China sort of put what they were writing. They were reporting what was happening in Wuhan, but they were trying to put it in context. And I said, from what I can see, from what the WHO says and others say, there does not appear to be human-to-human transmission of this virus. And I said to them, look, don't be sustained. Since we now know this is a coronavirus, and among the coronaviruses include SARS and MERS, do not be shocked if there is limited human-to-human transmission, if you hear reports of that. And that's dangerous, it's bad, but it's probably something that can be gotten under control the way SARS and MERS are kept under control. SARS is gone, MERS breaks out occasionally when it jumps from camels to people, but it's usually brought under control pretty quickly. I said, so don't be shocked by that. What you worry about is sustained human-to-human transmission. And of course, by this time, there was a cover-up going on in China. It wasn't orchestrated by Beijing, I believe. It was orchestrated by the mayor of Wuhan, who was very concerned because he had a local Communist Party Congress that was going on, and he wanted everything to stay smooth for that. And he also had this, he was hoping to break the Guinness Book of World Records by getting 40,000 people together for a gigantic potluck dinner that would get him into the Guinness Book. And so he was ordering the doctors to be shut up. And he was the one who ordered the market closed down and hosed out, which of course is like wiping out a crime scene. You know, we're never able to figure out what was in that market. If they started an investigation, we might know a lot more about the origins of the virus. So a lot of contradictory and wrong information was coming out of China, and I was trying to offer advice to my colleagues, most of whom were not in Wuhan. They were in Hong Kong or Beijing for a while. And so I was just like, well, I think, you know, you might look this, or you might talk to this person. And I was talking to people, and I was listening to the WHO. And it wasn't until, I think it was the night of January 30th so they had developed the tests. The tests had gotten more widespread because, you know, they developed the test on January 12th or 13th, I think, but they didn't get widespread testing. And they went from, 50 cases with no deaths to 500 cases with 12 deaths to, I forget what it was, 5,000 cases with 100 deaths or something like that. And I suddenly went, wait a minute. I was literally on the subway thinking about the figures in my head, and on my way to my girlfriend's house. And any disease that doubles that fast is not stoppable. I mean, that's not SARS. That's not MERS. That disease is going to go pandemic. And if it's got that low a mortality rate, but has a mortality rate, but is that low a mortality rate and that high a transmissibility rate, that is the Spanish flu all over again. That is what happened in 1918. You had a disease that went around the entire world incredibly rapidly. It only killed about 2 to 3% of the total number of the victims. And so I was up. I still have the piece of paper I was scribbling on doing the math at my girlfriend's house. I ended up saving that. And I came into work the next day saying, this is going pandemic. This is going pandemic. This disease is going to be a pandemic. This is the big one. And because I've been waiting for the big one for years. The 2009 swine flu came out of Mexico. We thought was going to be the big one. Well, it definitely was the big one as far as transmissibility is concerned. It was not the big one as far as lethality is concerned. It actually killed fewer people than seasonal flu did that year. MERS looked like it was going to be the big one, but it turned out to be, not very transmissible. How it is that H5N1 bird flu never became more transmissible, we don't really know. But it's not. It killed 60% of people who get it, but only about, I think there's only 600 and something confirmed cases in the world. So I've been waiting for the big one. Always kind of assumed it was going to be influenza, but I had talked to one scientist in particular, Ian Lipkin, who said, I worry just as much about coronaviruses because he was an expert in them. And so I was saying to my boss, this is the big one. And she said, wait a minute, you can't write a story saying that until you've interviewed, you got to talk to at least a dozen scientists and see what they think. So I did. I called literally a dozen scientists, people like Tony Fauci, people who had, led attacks on other diseases, people, heads of the, disease fighting divisions at the CDC or at the WHO, people in those positions. And basically it came down to 8 said, yes, they thought it was going to be a pandemic. 2 said, no, they thought it was a false alarm. Scary, but a false alarm. And 2 just did not want to commit at all. So I went to her and I said, okay, I got 8 to 2 to 2. One of those 8 is Tony Fauci. And, he was not as controversial then as he is now, but he was just the guy who always advised the White House on these things. And she said, okay, write it. So I wrote that story saying experts say it looks like it's going to be a pandemic. The story did not make the front page. There was this about that, and there was another story about the flu about the disease in Wuhan. A story from China on the front page that day. And for a while, since it was still mostly contained in Wuhan, nobody believed me. I mean, at the times, I ran into a lot of skepticism, and I did for several months. For a while there, people just not believing that the situation was as dangerous as it was. On February 27th, Michael Barbaro invited me onto the Daily to talk about that. So this is a 3-week difference.
Yeah.
And by this time, I'm a lot more worried. And it's really looking, I mean, by this time, the big study of the first 44,000 cases has come out of China. We know 80% of the cases are, quote, mild, although mild could include everything up to hospitalization. But everybody took that as mild cold. But 20% of the cases were very serious. And on the daily, I talked about, I'm the kind of person who has a month's worth of food in the basement. If you really have a pandemic, you can have global food shortages. You can have, your crucial supplies can run out. If you've, in a pandemic with a 2% mortality rate, if you've got 300 friends and acquaintances, 6 of the people are going to die. And, one of my oldest friends' grandmothers died in the 1918 pandemic. And that just, I didn't realize what an effect I was having, but so many people have written to me since then saying, oh my God, that was terrifying. And that was the first time I took this disease seriously.
Yeah.
And so that's basically the run up to how it happened.
To add some additional context for people who, again, are not scientifically prolific or literate to the level that you are, a coronavirus, right? It seemed like a couple things I wanted to clarify here. One is that in your mind, it was really and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, the combination of the fact that there was a significant fatality rate and the extreme transmissibility of the virus, that those two things in combination is what got you so concerned that this would balloon into a pandemic. Is that correct, or are there other factors there?
Yes. No, that's it. The fact it was a coronavirus, that the only reason that mattered. There are dozens of families of viruses. If I knew all more, I might be able to say hundreds. Influenza viruses, coronaviruses, alpha viruses, bunya viruses, flavoviruses. There's all these different families of viruses, all based on one word or another. The coronavirus gets its name because all the viruses in that family look like a corona, a crown. They have these spikes on the outside under an electron microscope. And so we knew that family of viruses, virologists knew that family of viruses was dangerous because there had been SARS, which was clearly lethal. I think SARS kills 10% of the people who get it. There had been MERS, a coronavirus, which I think kills 30% of the people who get it. And then there were 4 highly transmissible but very benign coronaviruses with names like EK1 and OC13 or something like that. And those cause almost a quarter of the common colds that you see. So we've all had those viruses at one time or another in our life, but they didn't worry us because all we said was, "Oh, I have a cold." Nobody typed that virus, but that way this family of viruses has the possibility to be either very transmissible or very lethal. Usually, you don't get the two in combination, but anytime you get anything that's 2 or 3% lethal and very transmissible, you spew that around the world and you're going to lose millions of people. And we have lost, more than 5 million people now, and it's not close to over.
Yeah. And you had studied, potential issues like this. You mentioned SARS and MERS already in this conversation. So you knew that there were, I'm imagining that you had thought through what can happen in a situation like COVID-19 ended up being. As you're hanging out with your girlfriend and you're writing down the numbers, and your brain, I'm sure, is beginning to forecast of what could be coming here. Where was your head at that point? What did you think? And again, to put this in context in terms of time, this is January, February of 2020.
Late January, yeah. I became convinced it was going to be a pandemic basically on. I worried about it before, but I really became convinced on January 30th when that 10,000 cases. What was it? 2%. Anyway, when they finally they got 10,000 positive cases, and they realized it had about a 2% mortality rate. That's when I was sure. After that, my main feeling was I got to warn people. I got to tell people. I got to, this has happened before. And I spend a lot of time thinking, am I being too alarmist about this? or am I not being alarmist enough? Because, I was, as it turns out, too alarmist about the bird flu, the H5N1 bird flu. I thought that would develop the mutations it needed to become pandemic. And since it was already killing, 60% of the people who got it, just a little increase in transmissibility could be really, really lethal. It could have been like the Black Death. Well, but it never happened. Still could, but it never has. And there have been other bird flus, H7N9, H9N1, a couple of others that have been worrisome, and they've killed some people. And they've blown through like the turkey flocks in this country, like a tank, and killed or caused the culling of millions of turkeys. So I worry about that. That is one I was too alarmist about. I was not alarmist enough about the last Ebola epidemic, well, not the last, but the big one in West Africa, because I thought, Ebola, it's bad. There's no question it kills people, but the WHO and Doctors Without Borders have always gotten them under control in the past. So when my editor was saying, "Do you think we should rush over and cover this?" and my feeling was kind of like, "No, I'm not so sure this is going to get that bad." That most they've been brought under control. And I said basically, well, why don't you ask the guy in West Africa to cover it now? And then that virus reached the capital cities, and that changed the entire equation. And 11,000 people died. Had it just stayed in the really, really deep rural areas where it started, it just wouldn't have been able to reach enough people. Once it hit the capital cities in 3 different countries, its growth was explosive. And so I underestimated it. And then I scrambled to cover it. I think I got Zika right. I think I was the first one to raise the alarm outside of Brazil itself, about Zika. And I was being driven crazy in the early days of Zika because, this was Christmas time. It was a week after Christmas. And lots and lots and lots of New Yorkers and people from all the cold parts of the United States were going to the Caribbean on honeymoons. And it was very clear that the virus was all over the Caribbean and all the coastal parts of Latin America. And I was saying to the CDC, lots of pregnant women are going on these trips with their families, and lots of people are going on baby moons and people going on their honeymoons. You've got to issue an alert. These babies, and they dragged their feet for 2 weeks, and I ended up screaming at one poor guy at the CDC, a spokesman, so loud, and about pregnant women are calling me for advice, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm, not a disease alert service. And, the CDC has got to say something. Why are you delaying so long? And I got so mad, I ended up throwing my headset across the room as I hung up. And the whole part of the science newsroom next to me stood up and started applauding. For when somebody loses it at a government official like that and stuff, they were saying, okay. And about, it was another 5 or 6 days before the CDC finally issued its alert to pregnant women. And the delay was that they were telling every country that they were, that they were about to drop a big bomb into their tourist trade. Yeah. And they felt it was more important to alert those countries and soothe over those national egos than it was to tell pregnant women. And I was pissed off. But, I'm a reporter. I mean, now I'm writing sort of editorial-like things for Medium, but at the time I was a reporter, so all I could do was try to find some way to write a story saying why the CDC is delaying. And I did, and they were unhappy about it. But too bad. They should have gotten moving. So, I mean, anyway, this is a long way of answering the question of I think a lot about, am I getting this right? What level of alarm should I put out? Because when you work for the New York Times, a lot of people follow your lead. And you, if you're wrong, you look like a goat. So I'm pretty careful, but I, waited until I thought I had the data on my side. And then I said, this is really worrying. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, but this really worries me. And a lot of people could die. And a lot of people are dying.
When you had that data and you were personally convinced that COVID-19 was going to be a pandemic, first, I would love for you to just define that word for the audience of what a pandemic technically means. And then also talk about, given what you had known about COVID at that time, what you thought that was going to mean for global commerce, for day-to-day life for American citizens. How were you thinking about how this virus would end up actually affecting normal people's lives?
Okay. So pandemic, I mean, there was a formal WHO definition of a pandemic, which was sustained human-to-human transmission of a novel pathogen in 2 or more WHO regions. But that came back to backfire on them during the 2009 flu, because even though it was spread all over the Americas, all of the Americas is one WHO region. So there had to be, it was ridiculous. So they stopped trying to define it. Actually, the declaration of a pandemic is not what's important to the WHO. For them, what is important is the declaration of a PHEIC, which is pronounced Pike or Fike or Fake or other, which is a public health emergency of international concern. And that is actually something they are legally allowed to do. They declare a public health emergency of international concern. And they did that a couple of weeks before they declared the pandemic. The thing is that because people aren't familiar with the WHO and the rules it operates under, the press, other than me, was much more excited about them declaring it a pandemic than about the public health emergency of international concern. But they declared the pandemic only because they weren't being taken seriously before. They didn't want to do that because they were afraid if we declare a pandemic, then a lot of countries are just going to throw up their hands and say, okay, it's uncontrollable, there's nothing we can do, and just let it roll over them. And they still thought, because of the way China was doing it, that the disease could be contained with harsh measures. I think they referred to them as aggressive measures. They were avoiding saying brutal, draconian measures, which is what the rest of the world was saying about China. But ultimately they declared a pandemic, and that, set the alarm. That they did it because they needed to ring the alarm bell harder. People just weren't paying attention. Poor Tedros, the head of the agency, was every day he was holding a press conference saying there is a window of opportunity to stop this virus, but that window is closing. Other countries have to be more aggressive about preparing. And many, many countries, including this one, were absolutely refusing to take it seriously. So what did I think was going to happen? Well, I thought a lot of Americans were going to die. I thought to prevent that, we would have to imitate China. But I also knew we were not going to be able to imitate China. I mean, we couldn't even close the bathhouses in San Francisco in the 1980s, when it was very clear that AIDS was being transmitted in those bathhouses and large numbers of people were being infected and going on to die, because we Americans like our freedoms. And so I thought, I don't know what we're going to be able to do. I mean, I could say, here's what China's doing. Italy didn't take this seriously. Then Italy realized that, thousands of people were dying up in the cities in the north. And then they cracked down and they actually asked for advice from the Chinese as to how should we handle this. And the Chinese flew into Italy and said, you call us a lockdown? This is a joke. People are still leaving their houses. People are still traveling, spreading the virus around the country. You got to stop all traffic until you get this under control. So the Italians began to take it seriously. Clearly, things were totally out of control in Iran. We only knew that basically from satellite pictures and from stuff that leaked out. But the satellite pictures from Iran showed that they were digging gigantic mass graves. So something was really going wrong inside there. And it began to spread to other countries in Europe, and where we got a lot of information out of. But it was already, we didn't realize it, but it was already spreading in the United States. And we were just not, we were in a completely headless chicken phase for a long time because we didn't have the tests. The Chinese developed a test on January 12th or 13th. Within 48 hours, the Germans had developed a test, which became the WHO test. We should have just bought that test or imitated it. Instead, the CDC insisted on making its own test. They came up with a complicated test, which tested for 3 parts of the virus rather than 2. And they blew it. They contaminated their own lab. The test turned out to be no good. They shipped it around to different state labs, and the state labs said, hey, we're getting false negatives on these tests and false positives, even when we tried on the controls. They didn't allow anybody else to make their own tests. It turns out that some people were quietly making their own tests. Like, I knew somebody at a hospital in New York who told me, well, we know we have 5 patients and staff infected. And I said, how do you know? She said, we made our own tests. And she said, we're not, we can't reveal that to the FDA because they don't approve any of it. But, we didn't have any tests. So basically, for all of February, we were flying blind. And because we didn't know how widespread the virus was, and because we didn't know where it was. It was rampant in New York. It was and the metropolitan area. It was semi-rampant in Seattle, where it actually probably got to earlier. And then it spread outward from there with spring break, with a lot of other things. We did not need to shut down the entire country, but we didn't know that, because we didn't know that the virus was really, in the first wave, was only concentrated in New York, Seattle, San Francisco, parts of Northern California, a few other places. If we had known more, we would have been able to shut down the country in a much more judicious, sensible way and restrain the virus. Instead, we went from indifference to having to cancel everything: March Madness, Comic-Con, South by Southwest, all these other things. And people were going nuts saying, how can you, there was a rebellion against the idea of canceling all this fun and then shutting down the economy. And so there was this giant backlash against it. And of course, Trump's, response to a serious, strong warning from Nancy Messonnier of the CDC, saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when this virus gets to this country, and it's going to be very bad when it gets here. He was visiting India. The stock market drops 500 points. He flies into a rage and basically orders her shut up, thinking he can make the problem go away by just pretending it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. You can just kind of talk the stock market back up. And so, I had no way of knowing the country would react that badly, that ineptly to the virus, that the denialism was so great. I knew there would be denialism. I'd seen it in South Africa from Thabo Mbeki, the president, over the AIDS virus. Seen it in other African countries, just pretended they had no cases of AIDS. I thought once it became screamingly obvious that the hospitals were filling up and people were dying, that the president and everybody around him would change their tune and realize, hey, we have a real crisis on our hands, as eventually Boris Johnson figured out, as Angela Merkel figured out very quickly, as the Italians figured out after they watched people die in the north, as many countries, tried denialism, did it. It lasted briefly. They saw people dying. They changed their tune. In this country, we didn't change our tune. We really still haven't. A significant chunk of the country still won't get vaccinated because they just kind of don't believe either in the virus or the mask or the vaccine or whatever they don't believe in. They don't believe in it. And it's denialism. And I underestimated the amount of denialism and how much damage that would do to the United States.
Yeah.
I'm trying to calculate how many fewer people might have died if we had taken this as seriously as Germany did. And my rough calculation that I made in October was probably we would have lost 200,000 to 300,000 fewer people. Now, of course, Germany is having another wave, so we'll see what happens in the end. But some countries reacted, some countries didn't, and we were one of the big non-reactors, and we've paid for it in human lives.
Yeah. And we're going to do some Monday morning quarterbacking here related to what we could have done. I think you've already alluded to this may be your biggest observation. You can correct me if I'm wrong about this, related to what we could have done better that we didn't, which is just buying the German test and using that from the beginning. And that, that in concert with what it sounds like is botching our own testing ability from the CDC is in your judgment, one of the big reasons why it ballooned into the problem it did. Is that a fair assessment of your perspective? And what else could we have done that may have improved the situation domestically?
We could have either bought the German test, the WHO test, or the French one. Ultimately, Thailand had a working test. Lots of countries had working tests. We could have also turned to one of 500 labs in this country, and 500 is probably an underestimate, that could have made a perfectly good PCR test. There are many, many labs, even hospital-sized labs, that know how to put together PCR primers and make a test. And they had the sequence of the virus, so they could have done it. But there is a long-standing problem at the CDC that has an attitude that if it wasn't invented here, it didn't happen. And I saw that during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. There were all these great papers that have been written by French scientists about Ebola outbreaks in Gabon that the Pasteur Institute had fought. And you never saw the CDC referencing any of the French papers. They only referenced the studies that they had done fighting outbreaks in Zaire and places like that. And I thought, this is kind of the CDC likes to shut its eyes to it likes to steal credit from other scientists. There's a long problem history of that, of people sending samples and then the CDC tests the samples, and the scientists who sent the samples, get very low down credit, and the top scientists of the CDC took top credit. And the CDC likes to sort of box other people out of the things that it specializes in. And the FDA went along with this too. They were not approving tests by anybody else. So the FDA lurched from approving no other COVID test for the presence of the virus, no other PCR test, to approving way too many antibody tests to see if you'd had the virus. Like, they basically flung open the doors and said, send us your test, announce how it works, and give us your data, and we'll look into it and prove it later. And so there are all these really bad non-functioning antibody tests on the market for a while. And I was counseling everybody, don't take these antibody tests. They're so inaccurate that you're going to think you've already had the disease. You're going to act as if you've already had it and you're safe. And you're going to find out later that you didn't have the disease. You had a cold or the flu or something. Because, in January, the cold and flu were definitely circulating. We were on our way to having a pretty bad flu year that year. So a lot of people were sick, assumed they'd had COVID, when in fact they'd had the flu. Yeah. That was egregious. The failure to produce a good test within days, and instead having really a 2-month delay, just like I said, headless chicken phase. We were just stuck. We didn't know what was happening, and yeah. we didn't know that we didn't know. I mean, that was one of Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, where you really get caught when you don't know what you don't know, and you proceed anyway.
Yeah. If we would have been better prepared, if we would have had a better test, and we would have taken this threat very seriously from the beginning. I think you mentioned already that, in retrospect, it appears like where COVID initially was a serious problem was New York, Seattle, San Francisco. It was focused in a few different parts of the country. Paint the picture for the audience of what the forthcoming months could have looked like if we would have been better prepared, if we would have had adequate testing. How could 2020 have unfolded in a different way if we would have been ready?
Okay. Had we had testing, we would have known how widespread the virus was in New York. When we finally got tests in mid-March, I was really shocked because I wrote letters to my family, my friends, my softball team, the guys I play squash with and stuff, saying, get inside. I think this whole city is really hot with virus. And the reason I think that is because I know there was a big outbreak up at New Rochelle. I know there was a big outbreak in New Jersey. And I sort of assumed those are spreading, but I had no evidence. And then when the tests were spreading out, I was suddenly realizing, wow, a father in my friend's class has got the disease. And wow, 5 people in this hospital have the disease. And wow, one of my colleagues at the Times had died of the disease by that point. And, it was just like ping, 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 ping. And that tells you, boy, it's not isolated. It didn't stay in New Rochelle, the outbreak we knew about. It is spreading. And so had we had enough tests early on, we could have known where the virus was, and one thing we would have done is we would have shut down travel from New York to the rest of the country. The first place the virus went out of New York was down to Florida. Lots of New Yorkers fled town. They headed to Florida. There was a ring of positive cases around New York City that basically was just about the size of where New Yorkers own vacation homes, sort of up to the Berkshires, over into the Poconos, out to the very tip of Long Island, out to Montauk and stuff like that. And I just thought, like, God, this is New Yorkers holding up in the country, and they've all carried the virus with them. And that's why, things like Rhode Island were doing things like turning away cars with New York plates on them. That's not an irrational response. It sounds horrible. What do you mean New Yorkers can't fly? Well, you want to, now we're putting this imposition on South Africa, stopping all flights from Southern Africa. People saying that's outrageous. The virus is already here. The virus is here, but there's a difference between one person walking through a dry forest with a lighted match and 1,000 people walking through a lighted forest. You're going to get a lot more fire if you send 1,000 people in. So you want to try to slow down the transmission of people until you have a handle on how big the problem is, how dangerous it is, which we're learning about the Omicron variant. The same thing could have happened then if we'd been prepared. We would have been able to say, let's shut down travel. Let's go into lockdown here in New York City, but there's no reason to go into lockdown in Houston or in Missoula, Montana, or any place else, because right now there's almost no virus in those places. And let's come up with an isolation plan, as the Chinese have done. They were smart in that they didn't let anybody, once they were positive, nobody went home to quarantine, no home quarantine. Once you turned positive, you sat there in the room until they found you a hotel room or eventually a spot in one of these. They created all these hospitals that were really just gymnasiums with nurses and oxygen tanks where they kept an eye on people who were sick. And if they crashed, which is typical second week crash in this disease, if they crashed, then they would be put into a regular hospital. Mostly they were just kept there for 10 to 14 days until they were no longer infectious and they could go home to their family. And because they had figured out very early on, 70 to 80% of the spread was within the family. In their first wave in China. And so if we had managed to pull people out as soon as one person if we managed to do testing fast, pull people out and isolate them in a nice way. You're not hanging people up by their thumbs in a dungeon somewhere. You're basically saying, please sleep in this cot in this gymnasium, and there will be nurses around to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Because one phenomenon is that people would go home and they'd think they're okay for a few days, and then suddenly their oxygen levels would drop, and they'd in the worst part of the pandemic, they couldn't get an ambulance because the ambulances were all filled and people died at home because they couldn't get care in time. It's actually much better to isolate people under the eyes of nurses. And so you can find the ones who are crashing and help them. So, yeah, a lot of these things we should have done. But instead, we chose denialism.
I would love for you you've already a couple times mentioned the Spanish flu of 1918, early 20th century, and contrast that pandemic and that disease with the coronavirus, with COVID-19. What's the difference between the two, and what do we now know happens to a human being who gets COVID-19?
Okay, so the Spanish flu is misnamed because it didn't start in Spain.
Spanish king, right?
Sorry?
The Spanish king got it, which is why they named it the Spanish flu.
No, they named it the Spanish flu because we don't know where it started. It may have even started in Kansas. Typically, influenzas tend to start in southern China because there's a lot of people who live with ducks and chickens and stuff in their houses in winter, especially in those days. And usually new flus are mixed of avian genes because ducks and geese and other waterfowl are the original hosts of flus in the same way that bats are the original host of coronaviruses. I'm really going off into virology tangents here, but no, the reason it got called the Spanish flu is because it went certainly from America with the American army over to France. It went through the French army, the English army, the German army. Large numbers of soldiers were dying at the front. Large numbers of soldiers were out of action. But military censorship meant that it could never be discussed because it would, cause a drop in morale. So only when the flu got to Spain and large numbers of people began dying in Spain were the newspapers filled with these reports, because there were no military censors in Spain since they weren't part of the war. And so that's why it got identified with Spain. It may be that the Spanish king caught it, but it was already known as the Spanish flu. So flu, there's a difference between coronaviruses and flu viruses. They both attack the lungs, but the flu viruses attach to a different set of receptors. They're called the sialic acid receptors. And they do mostly lung damage, whereas this virus attaches to ACE2 receptors, which are very common on the insides of your blood vessels. It's a vascular disease, and that's why it attacks not just the lungs. Anywhere you have a really fine network of blood vessels in the body, they're going to attack it. So that's your lungs, it's your kidneys, to some extent it's your heart. So you get lots more kidney damage and stuff with this disease than you did with Spanish flu. Spanish flu, people tended to hemorrhage a lot in their lungs. They died within 24 to 48 hours. They turned blue from being unable to breathe. And when they dissected people, their lungs would be like soggy, weighing 5 times as much as they ought to weigh and basically filled with blood. Whereas if you dissect the lungs of COVID patients, they tend to be stiff and crumbly. And it's that they haven't had huge hemorrhages. People aren't coughing up blood from COVID. Instead, you get the cytokine storm, in which a lot of inflammatory chemicals and stuff get in there, and they make the lungs incredibly brittle and break. But also the damage goes all over the body. So a lot of people die from kidney failure from this. A lot of people end up on, when somebody comes into the hospital with COVID, they automatically give them anticoagulants. That's part of the standard repertoire now, and to keep the blood from clotting. And and very often people who are very sick from COVID end up on dialysis because their kidneys are failing. So they're similar in that they're very transmissible. They're similar in that they have similar amounts of lethality. But look at it this way. In 1918, basically, when somebody got sick, all you could do was put them to bed and bring them chicken soup. I mean, we did not have bottled oxygen. We did not have antibiotics. And a lot of people died of secondary bacterial infections after they got the flu first, it damaged their lungs. Bacteria got in, they died of bacterial infection. So antibiotics would have made a difference. Bottled oxygen made a difference. Obviously, we didn't have ventilators. We didn't have ECMO machines. We didn't have all these things. We didn't have steroids to keep people's lungs cut down the inflammation in their lungs. And obviously, we didn't have any of the monoclonal antibodies or any of that stuff. So this disease, I think, is actually more dangerous. In other words, had this disease struck in 1918, more people would have died. Even the first Chinese study said, and that was the first version of the virus. We've gone through many mutations since then, many variants since then. But the first version of the virus, 80% of people got it and recovered on their own. And this is of the symptomatic. They didn't even know about the asymptomatic people. The symptomatic people, 80% of them recovered on their own. 20% needed oxygen or more. So figure half the cases are asymptomatic. That's probably generous. So 20% of half or 10% of these people need oxygen or need to be on a ventilator. We didn't have oxygen or ventilators. So if this disease had struck in 1918, it probably would have had a 10% lethality rate. I mean, that's totally back of the envelope thumbnail epidemiology, but more people would have died if this virus had struck in 1918 than if Spanish flu had struck in 1918. So, I mean, we're very lucky we live in the age we do. It's amazing to me that we've made vaccines as rapidly as we did. The record before was 4 years for making the measles vaccine back in the 1960s. And it's only because we spent billions of dollars to pay for very, very large clinical trials was that they could push the vaccines through the testing process very quickly. And also they could make the vaccines a lot faster. You're practically typing it out, once you know the genetic sequence. But you have to do a lot of work to make sure that the spike protein is stabilized and things like that. But once they did it, mRNA technology produces vaccine pretty fast. And if you recruit 40,000 people into a trial and half of them get the vaccine and half of them get the placebo, you pretty quickly get a signal in the differences between the two arms that shows you whether or not the vaccine works.
Yeah. And I want to get into the vaccinations specifics. And just for reference, we're having this conversation in December of 2021, early December of 2021. I want to talk to you about the months in the teeth of the pandemic, from early 2020 into mid 2020 to late 2020. You're writing constantly at this time. What, prior to the vaccine being created, what did you think the outcome of this was going to be for the world and for the United States?
Well, I didn't want to try to predict how many people were going to die. The early models said if the United States did nothing, just kept pretending this didn't happen, that 2.2 million people would be dead by October of 2020. Obviously, we haven't hit 2.2 million now. We're 700 plus thousand, close to 800,000. The articles I wrote, and I was mostly writing these big 5,000 word long, where are we now kind of articles. I mean, I was writing things in between that, but those are the things that I was kind of known for at the time. And plus the appearances on the Daily. And my articles were just unbelievably gloomy. I mean, they were illustrating them with black and white pictures just to sort of emphasize the gloomy aspect. And, lots of pictures of rows of refrigerated trucks parked behind hospitals and bodies being carried out in body bags. And, I just kept writing articles saying, look, people are not taking this seriously. We're coming out of lockdown in time for Memorial Day, and if people go out and get together for Memorial Day parties, there's going to be a new surge. And sure enough, there was a summer surge, and the spring surge was mostly in the Northeast. The summer surge was mostly in the South. It was all across the nation, but it tended to be concentrated in the South. And then the back to school surge, which became the Labor Day surge, became the Thanksgiving surge, became the Christmas surge. That gigantic one, that was the big peak of the deaths. That was all over the country. And then we had the later UK beta surge and then the Delta surge. And now we'll see what happens with this one. Sorry, I'm losing track here. I was really gloomy for basically all of the spring and all the summer, and writing about how the governors are asking for trouble if they are reopening their states at a time when their cases are rising. Because if your cases are falling, where the bottom is, where the sort of baseline level. When your cases are rising, if you just do things that are going to increase the caseload, you have no idea where the top is. You don't know when the curve is going to bend over and start going down again. And the danger is, of course, that your ICUs will get crowded. And that studies were showing by the VA and stuff that if you went into an ICU that was more than 75% occupied, your chances of surviving were cut by half. A crowded ICU is a bad place to be, when you've got exhausted doctors and nurses and supplies run out and people are on all the ventilators are taken, or you've got two people hooked to one ventilator, or all those things. Just stuff goes wrong and people die when stuff goes wrong. Then earlier than anybody else, I suddenly had this burst of optimism, and I think I wrote that story in October, because I could see the data from the vaccines, the very early data, the monkey data, the phase 1 data, was suggesting that they would work. And I've been following mRNA vaccines for a while, because since I cover global health, I pay attention to new advances in vaccines. And everybody knew, I didn't know many details, but I knew that the mRNA vaccines were considered very likely to be safe, because they were not using any sort of whole virus. They were just putting a little tiny stretch of RNA into you that got broken down very quickly by the enzymes in the body, so that we knew it was safe. We never knew if it would work. It was like a great idea. You could type out a new vaccine, the sequence of bases really quickly. We never knew if it worked. And then suddenly, when the data came out in the monkeys, holy cow, it worked really well. Those monkeys were protected. And then when the phase 1 safety data doesn't tell you anything, just tells you that people didn't have bad side effects, that was reassuring. We didn't expect that. But when a little bit of the early data came out showing that people were actually protected by the vaccines too, I thought, oh man, this is going to change everything. And so I wrote, I think it was late September, early October, I wrote an article that was illustrated with a picture of a house under attack with these giant clouds, but there was this one tiny beam of light shining down through the clouds. On this house, it looked like maybe there was some possibility it was going to be saved. And I said, I'm actually optimistic for, winter's going to be hell. Winter's going to be hell, but I think by next spring we're going to have a lot of vaccines, because Operation Warp Speed looks to me like it's likely to work. That they have spent the money now to produce millions and millions of doses. And these vaccines the mRNA vaccines look like they might work. And actually, there was a meeting of the science department with the managing editor, and he went, "You, Donald, you're optimistic. You're Mr. Cassandra, Mr. Gloom and Doom." And I said, "No, I'm actually beginning to think this might be over in less than 4 years," which I feared. That we'll have a vaccine soon, and if we all take the vaccine, if it turns out to be as protective as these early indications are, we could beat this. And then when the later figures came out showing the vaccine was 95% effective, holy shit, that's not, they were hoping for something that was 50% effective. And Moncef Slaoui, who was the head of Operation Warp Speed, had told me early on that he expected them to be maybe 75%. He said, I don't consider 50% a floor. I consider, 75% they might be. And I thought, okay, that's pretty optimistic. That'll definitely get approved if it's that. And then it turned out, 95%. And 2 vaccines with 90+% of efficacy. I thought, this is great. This is going to be the end. It's all a question of how fast we roll out the vaccines. And I assumed people would take them. I assumed it would not be easy in the beginning because there was all that talk about, like in the early surveys, 50% of the people said they weren't going to take a vaccine. They thought it was rushed. And I thought, okay, the way this normally works is lots of people express fear of the vaccine. Then they see it begin to work. Their friends and neighbors get it. Nobody grows a third leg. Nobody's eyeballs turn purple and fall out. And then word keeps coming out more and more that, hey, it's working. And you see people who are vaccinated not getting sick and people who aren't vaccinated getting sick. I thought, okay, facts on the ground will convince people. Well, I was right in that it wasn't 50% resistance to the vaccine, but it's astonishing how much resistance to the vaccine there has been, that there's been a good third of the country that, either says, I'll never do it, or I'll do it only if I'm forced. And forcing them has been pretty successful, among hospital employees, nursing home employees. I thought there was no question they were going to have to force people, and that because lots of people who work in nursing homes and hospitals try to avoid getting the flu shot every year. And, the doctors all get the shots, but some of the nurses, especially the sort of lower, less educated nurses, basically have a hard time believing the precepts of medicine, even though they practice in the medical field, and they're afraid of vaccines. And the hospitals have to control it by making them wear masks during the flu season. I thought there would be resistance, but I also thought there'd be mandates, like immediately saying, come on, you're not allowed to come to your work and kill your patients. That should be obvious. And it was clearly going on in the VA hospitals. It was going on in nursing homes. The diseases weren't arising spontaneously in the nursing homes. People were dying because visitors or staff members were bringing it in, and then suddenly no more visitors were allowed. So clearly it was the staff members introducing it into these places. And just like, you got to tell people, it's either get vaccinated or lose your job. And, it took us a long, long, long time to get to vaccine mandates. And, I thought we should have vaccine mandates that says, you don't fly on an airplane unless you can prove you're vaccinated. You don't get to, go into a movie theater. I mean, obviously you got to let people shop for groceries and do some basic things in life, but there are many, many things in life where we ought to be doing, as a few cities are doing, like San Francisco and New York, saying, you can't come into my restaurant unless you can prove you're vaccinated. You can't come into, your kids can't come back to school unless they prove they're vaccinated. We make kids get vaccinated against most diseases in school. People don't want to go back to the days when you see people. I've seen films of kids dying of diphtheria and people dying of those old diseases, and it's horrible. And I think everybody ought to be forced to see those films so they can understand what we missed, what we dodged by having vaccines. 1/3 of all kids in this country usually did not make it to adulthood. That's what you could count on. That's why my parents had 5 kids, and my stepmother's parents had 5 kids, and when they got married there were 10 of us, and you counted on having a bunch of kids because you didn't expect all of them to make it to adulthood. Catholicism was also part of that, but in my family, but it was just routine. You had a lot of kids because if you wanted somebody to support you in your old age, especially in the days before Social Security, you had to count on losing about 1/3 of your kids.
Yeah. In your judgment,
I'm wandering a little, right?
Well, I think it is still relevant. I don't know what the current numbers are in terms of the vaccination rates in the country, but I think it's in the 70s roughly that all adults. Yeah. It's something like that.
Yeah, it's mungy because you get people with 1 dose, 2 doses, and 3 doses. You get kids and teens who haven't been vaccinated yet but are going to be vaccinated. But it looks like around 1/3 of the country, or a little less than 1/3 of the country, is resistant to one degree or another.
I would love to.
That's not enough to maintain to stop this disease. It's very clear that the level of herd immunity we're going to need with this disease is probably going to be around 90%. And you get there through a combination of vaccination and infection. But with the new variants that are more transmissible, having been infected once doesn't necessarily seem to protect you. This disease may be with us for a while.
Yeah, I would love to give you an opportunity and a forum to address. Right. The people who are not getting vaccinated, in my assessment, they have reasons as to what their concerns are. They have concerns that they will willingly tell you if you ask them why they don't want to do it. I would love for you to speak to what you have heard to be the common resistance, the common arguments against getting vaccinated, both for adults and children, and what your response would be to people like that who are concerned.
Well, there's not just one common argument. There are people who believe the vaccine makes you magnetic. I mean, you can put a nail up to their foreheads and say, or up to your forehead if you've been vaccinated, and say, look, I'm not magnetic. Run a magnet over me. There are people who believe that the vaccine contains microchips and that for some reason Bill Gates is interested in knowing where you are at all times and that there's a microchip that can tell him what you're thinking, like Bill Gates cares. But a lot of it, lots and lots of people, Black Americans, worry about Tuskegee. Black Americans have been experimented upon. And so there is a legitimate reason to fear what's happened in the past. But, any number of Black doctors have said, look, I get it. This isn't Tuskegee. This will save your life. If you don't get it, you're contributing to the death of Black Americans. And that has happened. They've been hit harder than many other ethnic groups. Was it Nicki Minaj who put out the tweet about her cousin, growing gigantic testicles after his vaccination and becoming sterile? That scares lots of people off. There's any number of crazy levels. And then there's people who just say, well, I'm still doing my research. I was fishing a little while ago in New Mexico, and I realized my guide, who was 20 years old, great fishing guide, as I talked to him, he was not vaccinated. His uncle had died of COVID. His father had MS and was very much at risk. His girlfriend was pregnant, and neither one of them been vaccinated. And I tried to explain to him why I'd be vaccinated. By the time we finished talking, he said, nobody's ever explained this to me before. That makes sense. And because I talked about how pregnant women's immune systems are lowered automatically in order not to reject the baby and a lot of other things. And I don't know that I persuaded him, but he said, no one has explained this to me before. And the problem is, people have to take some responsibility for educating themselves. You can't just say, I'm still doing my research. It's been months and months and months now. You got to decide whether or not you really know whether it's dangerous or not. And unfortunately, it's a question of who do you choose to believe? Do you choose to believe? It's become Tony Fauci versus Tucker Carlson. Well, which one has spent his whole life as a doctor saving people, and which one is an attention-getting moron? Actually, he's a very smart guy, but he's just a guy who's probably been vaccinated himself and yet is scaring people away from the vaccine. It's appalling how many people have contributed to the deaths. Well, like I said, probably if we'd done better, there'd be 200,000 people, 300,000 people alive right now who are dead. And Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and everybody, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and everybody else who has contributed to making people afraid of vaccine have that blood on their hands. But by saying that doesn't persuade anybody. Facts don't persuade people, I'm sorry to say, or some people who get an idea fixed in their head and have decided that you are the enemy, that you are the representative, of big pharma, or that I'm a shill for big pharma, or a shill for, the NIH, or a shill for whatever. Well, if you've read my coverage, I've been very hard on big pharma most of my life, but it doesn't matter. People don't read your coverage. People just sort of assume since you're saying something they disagree with, they assume you must be part of the enemy, and so. I don't know a way to persuade anybody except to wait until they see somebody they know and trust die from lack of vaccine. And that is happening, the sorry anti-vaxxer and the Herman Cain Awards and stuff, the websites that make fun of people who've been vaccine denialists and then have died of COVID. Those are very popular websites for people who are full of schadenfreude and like to laugh at other people's misery. And unfortunately, watching people die is not much more persuasive than that. In the old days, there were people who didn't believe in polio vaccine. There were people who didn't believe in smallpox vaccine. There were people who didn't believe in diphtheria vaccine. But anybody who's watched a baby die of these things says, oh my God, what can I do to save my next child? Or what can I do so that what happened to that baby, my sister's baby, doesn't happen to mine? And that's the way people get persuaded. But that's the hard way. That's the path through the graveyards. I mean, we'll get there. We'll get to herd immunity. But we're taking a very hard, long path right through the graveyard and down the stone paths to herd immunity.
Yeah.
Through vaccine reluctance and people who get infected, because they got unlucky.
Yeah.
They die.
Is it your assessment of what you understand about the vaccine, its rollouts, its effects on people, that it is essentially fully safe for virtually anyone to take?
It's an amazingly safe vaccine. Amazing. I found my mother's notes of my vaccine records. So I was born in 1954, and my mother kept incredibly careful records of all the shots I got until I was like 13 years old. Now, the smallpox vaccine in those days was a vaccine so dangerous that it could kill somebody who was immunocompromised. Not everybody, but it killed people. The diphtheria vaccine in those days caused seizures in 1 out of 3,000 shots. A bunch of the other vaccines had problems. Sorry, it wasn't the diphtheria; it was the pertussis vaccine. The whooping cough vaccine caused seizures. So I had 4 smallpox shots as a child. Because that was normal, I had 6 of the triples, which contained the diphtheria booster. So if you've got a 1 in 3,000 chance of having a seizure each time you get the shot, and I got the shot 6 times, I'm not sure I'm doing the math right, but that sounds like 1 in 500 chance of having a seizure. And my mother actually said there was a time when I was sick when I was a little kid that I had what she thought was a seizure, that I was raving about flies on the ceiling or something, and then I went into a kind of a catatonic state. It's not unusual for kids with high fevers to have seizures. It might not have been caused by the vaccine. I might have just had a bad cold and had a high fever because of that. But in any case, having a seizure as a child is not the end of the world. I know people have had a single seizure, but you don't want that, because sometimes people have seizures and they end up, some people die of them. But those vaccines were so dangerous, and yet my parents' generation all gave them to their kids because they had known people who lost kids who died of measles. They had known people whose kids had died of diphtheria, or maybe not when they were having babies, but when they were little. They had heard tales from my grandmother of people dying. People died of scarlet fever. People died or they were permanently damaged in life from scarlet fever, because it goes to your heart and it messes up your heart valves. And so they had seen those deaths, and so they accepted these things very willingly, even though they knew the vaccines were dangerous. The mRNA vaccines are, compared to those vaccines, insanely safe, and so are all the others. Yes, there are some cases of myocarditis, not nearly as many cases of myocarditis as there are, which is heart inflammation. Not nearly as many cases of myocarditis as there are from people who from getting COVID. I mean, it's a vast difference between your chances of getting myocarditis if you have COVID and your chances of getting myocarditis if you have if you've had a vaccine. It's almost not even worth mentioning. I mean, the side effects are so few and so far between. It's the job of the media to report the news they hear, the news that's relevant. So of course they report it, but people, the anti-vaxxers then spin this up and make it sound like the vaccines are really dangerous. And they're constantly pointing to small numbers of side effects, and really the side effects from these vaccines are very, very, very low. And the anti-vaxxers, everybody sort of thinks of the anti-vaxxers as this kind of union of concerned moms who are worried about their kids. No, it's a bunch of millionaires. It's the people in the vitamin industry. It's people in the clinic industry who with alternative cures, or people who are pushing vitamins, pushing herbal supplements, pushing, hyperbaric chambers and pushing chelation. They never let reporters into any of their conferences because they know that they are pushing an anti-vaccine story and a lot of fables in order to get notoriety for themselves and to sell their alternative cures. And those alternative cures ultimately kill people. And some of them are literally dangerous, and some of them are pointless. Like the whole Laetrile, all the people who went to Mexico to get apricot pit treatments for cancer. the apricot treatment didn't hurt them, but the fact that they didn't get regular cancer drugs killed them. They died of cancer because of that fixed care. That's how I feel about the anti-vax industry, that they are keeping people away from legitimate prophylactic measures and therefore putting them at risk because they're interested in making money and selling them vitamins.
Yeah. You mentioned
not that vitamins aren't a good thing. Vitamins are a good thing. You should definitely have, a full complement of your vitamins, your minimum daily requirement, maybe a little bit extra, but they are not, the people who push them and push herbal supplements. It's an industry with just a lot of bad actors in it.
Yeah. The final few things I wanted to go over. The first is related to vaccines and vaccine mandates. And I would be interested to know if you know, from a legal perspective, the history of vaccine mandates, if they exist in the US, and what precedent might be tapped into or referenced to mandate that children and employees get vaccinated. Is that something that has been legislated in the country, that has gone through the legal system? What's your knowledge related to that?
Okay. Yes, this is actually very clear. And when I said, I did a session for the newsroom at the Times back in early December, I think it was last year, where I said, people need to understand that there's very clear law and Supreme Court precedent on this. You can make people take vaccines, or you can't necessarily hold them down on the sidewalk with your knee on their chest and stick a needle in their arm, but you can definitely punish people for not taking vaccines, and you can require vaccines as a condition of entry to places, entry to school, entry to employment, and things like that. The famous case, the really definitive case in this law, is a 1905 case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And Jacobson was a Lutheran pastor in Massachusetts back in the 1890s who refused to take the smallpox vaccine. It was, a descendant of the original cowpox vaccine. And Massachusetts passed a law. Now, be it said, this is not federal law. This is state law, and it's state by state. So this is really the federal government, even through World War I and stuff, was not involved in trying to control diseases. That was always seen as a city matter and a state matter, as a matter of law. But he refused to get vaccinated, claiming that he had been vaccinated as a child in Sweden and that it's something, he'd had a bad outcome, but also just saying, this is my personal liberty, I refuse to be vaccinated. The punishment was a $5 fine, but it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that absolutely the state could require him to be vaccinated or make him pay the $5 fine. And the reason, conservatives tend to see this as sort of like the Second Amendment, that, I have a right to my gun, the state can't take away my gun, and the state can't stick its vaccines in my body. And liberals tend to see this as sort of like Roe v. Wade. I have a personal right to privacy. You can't take away my right to an abortion, and you can't, violate my body by making me take these vaccines. This has nothing to do with your personal rights. It has to do with the police powers of the state. It is more like the power of the state to take away your gun if you are walking down the street shooting people. In other words, the state exists, the government exists, partially to protect citizens from each other. You have a police force in order to stop somebody from walking through town like a Viking, killing anybody that he disagrees with. You restrain people. Well, in those days, diseases, pandemics were constant in those days. Scarlet fever, smallpox, things like that, blew through the population. Mortality rates went up and down. Large numbers of people died. And so once there was a way of preventing people from dying, namely a vaccine, so that you didn't lose a third of the kids, in the country when smallpox came through, people were required, everybody in Massachusetts was required to take the vaccine. And because to prevent them from killing other people was the basis of the law. That is still the precedent, and the Supreme Court has gone by, and that has allowed things like vaccination requirements in school. I mean, kids to go to school in most states in this country, in all states in this country, have to have a whole plethora of shots. You have to have measles shots. You have to have had whooping cough shots. You have to have had, tetanus shots. You have to have lots of things so that you don't spread the disease over. Some of these are communicable diseases. Tetanus is not a communicable disease, but you still have to have had all these shots. And that's been totally legal and upheld all these years. The OSHA requirements that Biden is using is a little trickier. It's very clear that companies can require people to basically keep a healthy workplace, as in, if you've got communicable multi-drug resistant TB, you can't come work in my kitchen if you work in my restaurant. I can legally exclude you because you are putting me and all my other workers and all my customers at risk of death. So, similarly, you can make people wear hard hats for their own, and you can require all sorts of things to happen on a work site so that fewer people die. The standards you set for safe scaffolding and things like that. Those kind of things can be imposed by the state. So that is considered normally something you can impose. It's being battled because there hasn't really been precedent for vaccination in the workplace before. But it's, a lot of scholars think this ought to fall under the precedent of the kind of, establishing, keeping a safe workplace that OSHA is responsible for. And so, a lot of companies have been very eager to put vaccine mandates on their employees, but they were waiting for leadership from the federal government. And you can put vaccine mandates on airlines and things like that because you're allowed, for the same reason you can take guns and knives away from people when they get on an airplane. You want to be able to prevent them from spreading germs to each other as well as, bullets to each other.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it really is a state decision, but provided the state is mandating the vaccinations, that historically was upheld by the Supreme Court.
As far back as 1905, when this was clear. Now, people are going to find reasons to fight it. The same reason, the legal basis for Roe v. Wade is actually a lot shakier than the legal basis for this decision. There's no mention in the Constitution of I'm not going to get into that. I don't need the trouble this is going to get me. But believe me, the Constitution, the whole notion of forming a government is to prevent one citizen from harming others. And so, defining the limits of the police powers of the state takes up a lot of time of the courts, but part of it depends on the idea that the state does have police powers to create a safe environment for its citizens to live in. And this was seen, the vaccines were seen as part of creating a safe state, a place, part of stopping diseases that kill people in the state. You can take a lot of measures. The same way you can quarantine people who have diseases. I mean, there was no question in those days that when somebody had polio, when somebody had measles, when somebody had scarlet fever, you could lock them in their house, nail a sign to the door, big red letters saying measles inside, and the sign said no one comes in and no one goes out without permission of the Board of Health. And if you had to post a policeman in front of the door, you could do that because that was the way you stopped communicable diseases in the old days.
Yeah,
and we're facing communicable disease.
We're now roughly 2 years out from what the beginning of the spread of the coronavirus, and I'd be curious to know, given your knowledge of what we now know about it, if what you believe to be the genesis of the coronavirus in the first place, of COVID-19. Is it? You can speak to that in however much detail as you'd like.
Okay, you mean? Are you asking me? Did it come from an animal, did it leak from a lab in China? I mean, okay. The answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I became pretty controversial a few months ago when I wrote an article on Medium that got a lot of play that said it is time to give the lab leak theory another serious look. And the reason was because the lab leak theory had basically been popped out in early 2020. And I went into some of the origins of that theory, but it eventually shifted over to the point where it was considered part of crazy QAnon, Kung Flu, anti-Chinese, talk, and dismissed. by the media. And I had written an article back in, started in February 2020, and then rewrote it. I think I sort of abandoned it in April 2020, that essentially said, it's quite clear that it was not a lab leak, that it was a jump from an animal, scientists say. And the article never ran, partially because we had a sort of division within the New York Times as to whether to believe the people, mostly in the Trump administration, but some people, but national security people, many of them from the Trump administration, some of them from previous administrations, pushing the idea that this was a lab leak, but they were always talking off the record and they had no evidence. They just plain had no evidence when you asked them for what it was. It was more like, kind of rumors, and it could have happened, and there were some problems with this lab, but there was no proof. Meanwhile, all the world's virologists, who were looking at this virus, said this has all the hallmarks of an animal virus, and they were speaking on the record with their names used and explaining their facts in great detail. But there was still a sort of debate going on at the time. So the article sat, and also it was about 4,000 words long. It was full of words like, O-linked glycan shields and, receptor binding domain. I mean, now we're used to hearing things like spike protein, your receptor binding domain. But back then, my editors just kind of went, oh my God, I can't read this. And nobody wanted to take it on. So it just sort of sat until it died. But anyway, a few months ago, I wrote this article saying, hey, enough. Now, be it said, another former colleague of mine, Nick Wade, who used to work for the New York Times, senior to me and retired years ago, he had written an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist saying it's time to take another look at the lab leak theory. I disagreed with a lot of his precepts because he sort of saw the beginning of the lab leak theory in the EcoHealth Alliance, and he was attacking Tony Fauci, and I didn't agree with any of that. But his article pointed to a lot of things that have been written in the meantime. The most interesting part was some work that had been done by internet sleuths and virologists who realized, if you remember, very soon after the virus was discovered, the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, hey, we have a virus in our freezers that is not the same virus, but is 96% identical. And that made a lot of people go, aha, that's it. That's a smoking gun. If it's 96%, it must be it. And virologists all over went, wait. This virus mutates slowly so that in a virus of 30,000 base pairs, if only 96% of them are identical, that other 4% would have taken almost 40 years to get that many mutations in a virus that long. So they said this means these two viruses had a common ancestor in a bat somewhere, but they're not the same virus. That virus was known as RATG13, which sounds like rat 13, but it's actually Rhinopolis affinis, the name of the bat. TG for Tongguan Caves, where it was found, 2013, the year it was found. Okay, RATG13 was thought to be some virus they just happened to pull out of their freezer and say, hey, we have something that's 96% identical. Isn't this an interesting curiosity? Turns out, in the intervening year, it had been figured out they had actually been working with that virus for a while, but under a different name, RABT. I've forgotten the number, but it was the same virus. It was under a different name, and they knew that virus had come from a cave where miners had gotten pneumonia because they were digging bat guano out of the cave, used for fertilizer, bat poop. And some of those miners had died. So that means it was not just some random virus, one of hundreds of viruses they had gotten in sampling bats from caves. This was actually a virus. They'd gone to do an investigation of the deaths in that cave, and people had died of pneumonia. That makes it a virus that somebody would very likely have chosen to play with if they were doing gain-of-function research, which is taking a virus and seeing if you can make a dangerous virus more transmissible or a transmissible but mild virus more dangerous. I know that doing that kind of research sounds crazy. People think, why in the world would we do that research? You do it kind of for the same reasons that you do nuclear testing. Yep. You did not want to drop your bomb on Japan at the end of World War II without first having blown it up in Nevada or blown up a similar one in Nevada in order to see if it worked, because you don't want to lose an entire flight of planes in order to drop a dud on another country. You sometimes have to do dangerous research in order to prove that something, well in this case, if you have 100 viruses and you want to know which ones, and you know they're circulating and you want to know which one is most likely to become a pandemic virus, you might want to see if it only takes a few tweaks in that virus to see if it's dangerous, so that you can then make vaccines or monoclonal antibodies against that. It's dangerous work, there's no question. And probably doing it in the middle of a big city and having people going in and out and home at night, stuff like that, is not the right way to do it. But there are arguments for doing this kind of research. Some scientists, and I know scientists on both sides, some of them think there ought to be an absolute ban on this stuff. Some of them think it's necessary. It's dangerous, but it's necessary. In any case, we know the Chinese were doing similar work. The other thing that came out was that Shi Zhengli, who was the woman who runs the Wuhan Institute of Virology, had been doing chimera work, which is where you take the body of one virus and you put the head of another virus, so you put the spike protein of another virus on it, and you see if they infect human cells. All that added up to that, plus the fact that the Chinese have really been acting like a country with something to hide. They have not. Now, the non-sharing of the first virus samples doesn't bother me so much. I understood why they were touchy back in the beginning. They had an epidemic to fight, and they don't like it when the United States comes marching in and says, "Here, let us send in a team. We'll show you how to do things." The Chinese attitude is, "Hey, we've got a very good functioning CDC here. We have a lot of the world's top scientists. Many of them gone to Harvard Medical School and places like that, and then have come back to China. We can handle this. We don't need your snotty attitude, United States, and we don't need your insults either, calling it the Kung Flu." I understand why they were reluctant back then. But now, after more than a year, it would be a whole lot better if they wanted to reassure the world by saying, here's what we've got. We did our own investigation. We looked at all the lab logs. We know exactly what viruses were worked on in every one of these labs, not just the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but the sister labs nearby, the military labs that appear to be somewhat attached, people that she's trained, that Xi Jinping has trained, and we're sure that virus was not being played with and that this was not a lab leak. And here's how we know. They have not done that. They could have done. They could just open up the lab logs and say, here's what we know. So the whole concatenation of these things makes me think, I don't know if that's what happened, but it's less kooky sounding than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
And the only way we're ever going to know is not if we ask the National Security Agency to look into it. This is like asking the FBI to solve a murder in Moscow, but not allowing them to have visas to go to Moscow and, look at the crime scene. You can only count on the Chinese doing it. And whether or not the Chinese do it or not, I don't know. It seems to me the people who should be demanding an answer from the Chinese government is the Chinese people. They're the first ones whose heads are on the chopping block. If this virus, who did it kill first? Thousands of people in Wuhan. If they make another mistake like that, if it was a mistake, who will get killed first? Thousands of people in another city in China. So I'd say that the Chinese government has a responsibility to its own people to come clean and say, we absolutely know this was not a lab leak and we can prove it, and here's how we know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Short of that, the obvious answer is an animal spillover. I mean, because we saw that with MERS, we saw that with SARS. MERS very clearly jumps into humans from camels, gets from bats into camels, probably through camels eating fruit that bats have pooped on or gnawed or whatever. And we know that SARS got into people. It was a bat virus, somehow got into animals, probably civets and raccoon dogs that are sold in markets in China. And it may have jumped to humans that way. I mean, we're not dead sure. We don't have the proof, but that seems to be the most obvious route. So since we know there's a whole history, I mean, virtually all diseases we have come from animals. Even whooping cough is probably, it's related to kennel cough in dogs, and measles is related to a virus that cows get. Maybe all these things may have come from animals, or we give them to animals. You never know back in prehistory when, which way the jump went. But so animal spillover is the obvious solution. I'd really like to know. I'd really like if the Chinese did an open investigation and said to the world, here's what we know and here's how we know it.
Yeah. I appreciate you giving all that detail. Last question I would like to talk to you about is, kind of, you've alluded to some of this before, but where you think we go from here in terms of mitigating future risks of something like this happening in the U.S. in the future. How do you think about that? You've talked in detail about how we could have done a much better job related to testing, and that would have saved many, many lives. What would be your recommendations for the government, but also for citizens who are listening to this, related to what might be worth keeping in mind for future pandemics like the one we just experienced?
I'm not worried about just, little better surveillance or something. Look at it this way. This is something that Mike Ryan of the WHO has said to me for years. He says, look, you superpowers spend trillions of dollars preparing to fight World War III. Bombers, missiles, submarines, huge armies, trillions and trillions of dollars. How many people have died, as a result of missiles being fired at you? Zero, basically. How many people have died as a result of diseases? 700,000 from AIDS. I mean, just in this country, the phenomenal numbers of people die from these diseases, and we spend pennies on them. We are, the budget of the WHO is smaller than the budget of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. The amount of money we spend on surveillance for new viruses in Asia, in Mexico, and in our own country, anywhere, is a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of money we spend looking for missiles coming over the North Pole or sonar to pick up submarines going around the world. I mean, we hugely, hugely underspend. So I'd be in favor of, treating diseases as the true enemies that they are and spending much more money. One of the first things I do is I'd like to create a Pentagon for disease fighting. Who's in charge of fighting this pandemic? Ask yourself, who's actually in charge? I mean, okay, the president is in charge. The president's always in charge. Under him, who was in charge under Trump? Who is in charge under Joe Biden? Is it Tony Fauci? No, Tony Fauci's the head of a research institute. Is it Rochelle Walensky, head of the CDC? No, she's the head of the CDC. She can't give orders to anybody. They are essentially a disease investigation agency and a standard setting agency. Is it Jeff Zients or Andy Slavitt or anybody like the people who've been in the White House? Everybody, is it the head of the FDA? Is it the head of the NIH? Everybody has this little fragmented role to play in all these diseases. Whereas if we're fighting a war, you bloody well know who's in charge and whose head rolls if you blow it. There is a Joint Chiefs of Staff. There is a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There are generals in charge or admirals in charge of every one of the armed services. There is a general or an admiral in charge of every single military operation, from Operation Overlord to Desert Freedom. And if they screw up, they're out. And, more people die from this than die from that. So I would like a complete wholesale rewrite of the way we approach diseases so that it's on a more it doesn't have to be militarized so much as it has to be a chain of responsibility, so that it's very clear who's in charge, very clear where the lines of authority are, and very clear who suffers if they blow it and what the goals are. We're stumbling through this disease almost as badly as we stumbled through Afghanistan for 20 years. So then on top of that, there are lots of things I'd like to see done. I'd like to see us sampling. There is a thing called the Global Virome Project, where they're going to try to sequence every virus in the world. I think that's too complicated. Every virus in animals. I think we absolutely ought to be sampling humans all over the world, particularly humans involved in occupations that are likely to be animal spillovers. So small farmers in the third world, small villagers, people who go into caves to dig bat guano, people who smuggle wildlife, pay them $100 to give you a blood sample and then say, good, go on your way. We don't even want to. And can I take some blood from the animals you're smuggling? Things like that. But we're not going to bother you. We're not going to enforce the law. We just want to see what diseases you have, because if you can spot a virus that has already made the jump to humans, that already can infect humans, you have a huge jump on that's much more important than one of a dozen viruses that any bat might be carrying. I'd like to see laboratories built and supported all over the world, so you can do this work. You don't have to fly the samples all back to the CDC, and countries are reporting this kind of thing. Because of Ebola, we got started in that direction, but we need much more of it. I'd like to see much more international cooperation on other diseases the way we have on the flu vaccine every year. We're pretty good about sending flu samples all over the world. I'd like us to be sending samples of virtually every disease around the world. I'd like us to rethink the way companies make pills for diseases. I mean, right now, we've got the Merck pill and the Pfizer pill that both might work against COVID. It is much better to have a combination drug, a cocktail. We know this from AIDS. We know this from hepatitis C. We even know this from tuberculosis and other diseases. That cocktails of drugs work better. You have 2 or 3 drugs in one pill. The disease can't mutate to escape the pill if it's facing a cocktail of drugs. But companies can't do that because the antitrust laws in this country, dating back to the 19th century, prevent companies from working together. Okay, that's fine if you're trying to encourage competition in sewing machines or reapers or cotton gins or cars or anything else. You want a lot of competition, but you want life-saving drugs to be combined with each other. So I think we ought to carve out an exception to the antitrust laws in this country so the companies can work together to test their drugs together and put them together in the same pill. Because I think the big difference between a life-saving drug and a cotton gin. So and and I'm going to go into a lot of this in my book. I think there's many, many, many wholesale changes we need to make in this country in order to do a better job of fighting pandemics, because we are not ready for the next one. And believe me, this is not going to be the last pandemic. If I'm lucky, it'll be the last one of this magnitude in my lifetime. Definitely not going to be, in my kids and grandkids' lifetime. There'll be more. And it could be a lot worse. It could definitely be a lot worse. We got lucky with only 2% mortality or so with this one.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing all this information, because I feel like you're one of the people in the world who can actually speak to these kind of questions related to what happened, and more importantly, probably at this point, what we can do moving forward to try to reduce some of the risks. And maybe if you could plug your book in terms of when it's coming out, the name, it might be helpful for people to know if they want to access that information in book form.
I'd love to plug it. I have to finish it by October. Tentatively, the name is Lessons from Pandemics, but that might not end up being the final name. I've got people kind of roll their eyes and go, that sounds like it ought to be a textbook. So I don't know. I mean, my name is Donald G. McNeil Jr. And, maybe there'll be a book out there where you type that in and you'll be able to get a book when it's done. I'm just struggling. I don't have writer's block. You've heard me talk. I can't shut up. So the problem is actually forming it into a book length piece that makes sense. And it's supposed to be, it's not just about this pandemic. It's going to be about all the things I learned in 25 years of covering other pandemics and what lessons how that helped me predict this one or see this one early on, and how it would help us, what lessons we might take in that will help us prevent future ones.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this, man. It was really great to meet you. And I really appreciate you sharing all this information. I think this will be helpful moving forward for people to reference and to listen to. So I really appreciate the time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for, you've been very patient too. I can see that. I'm waving my arms and getting more and more caught up in this stuff. Some ways it's kind of nice to be unleashed. I don't have to worry about being so Timesian anymore. So I can
understand that.
Say what I actually think, which is not always friendly.
It's liberating.
Or objective. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Great to meet you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you are finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalkingpodcast. I truly appreciate all of you who are supporting the show.